I am a missionary from the veterans that I serve in the VA. For the last 15 years, all of my patients have been combat veterans with severe psychological injury, often with heavy drug and alcohol histories. They're now all clean and sober. Often with heavy criminal histories. A good many of them have been incarcerated and have committed crimes of violence and done very awful things to themselves and other people. I went to the VA intending to reopen my research laboratory, and the veterans saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and they kidnapped me, and they totally redirected my life. And I feel profoundly privileged to have these two projects, Achilles in Vietnam and now, predictably, Odysseus in America, which comes out of my experience with the veterans. And very simply, what I did in both books is to say, let's take Homer seriously. He said in the Iliad, this is the story of a soldier's rage. And then I took Homer seriously and said, let's see what we can make of the surface story of the Iliad. And it turns out quite a lot, because rage is the thing that has blighted the lives of these psychologically injured veterans. If it were simply the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which are recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as PTSD, then their lives would not necessarily be blighted. And I will talk about what it is that truly wrecks a veteran. And I'm here to tell you, it's not the PTSD that's in the diagnostic manual. It's the damage to good character. So, I've been asked to make trust my theme, and that's easy for me because that's exactly where it's at working with the veterans in the clinic. I won't try and summarize the middle part of my book, which is devoted to how it is possible to restore social trust once it has been destroyed. Once the capacity for social trust is lost, all possibility of a flourishing human life is lost. That is not true of simple PTSD, what is in the diagnostic manual. Simple PTSD is a war injury like any other. It can be very mild and uncomplicated, or it can be devastatingly severe, but it is simply a war injury. It may be disabling in specific ways, much as someone who has had an arm shot off is disabled in specific ways by the loss of that arm. Now, we don't talk of this veteran as having missing arm disorder. We talk of him as war injured and has a specific injury. Now, people with simple PTSD can have flourishing human lives and can adapt to it. There may be certain things that they can't do, like showing up in a crowded public place. If you're an infantryman, being in a crowd may just lifelong be non-negotiable. You're too much of a target for enemy snipers and mortarmen. You're not going to get me into a crowd. They know rationally that there are no snipers, but it's the persistence into civilian life of valid adaptations to the real conditions of combat. So that's simple PTSD, and that's not what wrecks people. That may disable them in specific ways, but it doesn't wreck them. What wrecks them is when they have lost the capacity for social trust. Now, I've said this phrase several times, and what does that mean? Well, in most modern settings, it means that you are willing to trust people on the basis of their institutional position and their credentials, so that when a veteran comes to the VA for medical care, they're willing to trust the doctor and the nurse on the basis of their having an MD and all that, and being hired by the VA, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when social trust is destroyed, that is no longer possible. And it's not replaced by a vacuum. It's not replaced by nothing. It's replaced by the active expectancy of harm, exploitation, and humiliation. We don't get anywhere, we don't add anything by calling that paranoia. As far as I'm concerned, we can drop the word paranoia from the language and not lose a doggone thing. Let's keep it close to the experience, which is the expectancy of harm, exploitation, and humiliation. Now, in the first part of the book, I compare the story that Homer tells of Odysseus. And we see very, very quickly that Odysseus is someone who does not trust anyone. And he does all kinds of terrible things along the way. And I apologize pretty insincerely, but I apologize nonetheless to those people who are going to really be upset with me for casting aspersions on their hero, Odysseus. I really have to forewarn you that my book does a number on him. And in fact, on page 236 is a section headed Summary of the Charges Against Captain Odysseus. In effect, I bring him up before a court-martial in my book, and the charges are pretty doggone serious. And if anything, I am being kinder to him than the active duty military officers I know would be on him. They would cut him no slack at all for the terrible, self-serving, and catastrophic way he had conducted himself as a military leader. They wouldn't let him off by the fact that he had been so amazingly successful as a reconnaissance leader, as a spy, as a deception planner, as a diplomat, and as a pretty passable staff officer to Agamemnon on the plains of Troy. So that I've just sort of gently touched parts 1 and 2 of the book, and because this is a military context, and because the veterans have made me their missionary to the armed forces on prevention of psychological and moral injury, because they don't want other young kids wrecked the way they were wrecked, I will devote the rest of my remarks to the subject of how can we preserve trust, how can we prevent these terrible injuries. I have learned from the veterans that there are 3 ways that trust is embodied in military institutions, in military practice and functioning. I shouldn't say institutions, because that calls to mind the image of tables of organization and stuff like that. That there are 3 things that protect the mind and soul of the service member. Number 1 is positive qualities of community in the face-to-face unit. what in military parlance is called cohesion. The second is competent, ethical, and properly supported leadership. And the third is prolonged, cumulative, and realistic training for what people actually have to do and face. So the prevention mantra is cohesion, leadership, training. Cohesion, leadership, training. These are not in the hands of BUMED, the Medical Bureau of the Navy or the Medical Corps in the Army. They are in the hands of the line leaders and trainers. So those are the three ways that trust is embodied in military practice. And what we have to do is to make sure that we get out of our own way. Now, it turns out when I'm talking to line leaders and trainers in the armed forces, this is a slam dunk. It's an easy sell because they say, well, but these are combat strength multipliers. Of course, we know about this. What's the problem? And I say, yeah, so why are we still shuffling our units like decks of cards? Why are we bouncing our leaders from billet to billet to billet so fast that they never get really good at any of the things that they're assigned to do? Why is it that our training is, with very few exceptions, is not cumulative? So that what happens is a unit, say an armor unit, trains up, they get to a point and they go to Fort Irwin to the National Training Center, and they're at the top of their game, as good as they are able to get in that time, and then they go back to their home base and they're blown to the winds. The unit is broken up and redistributed, and they have to start over. I have said in a study that I did several years ago for the Commandant of the Marine Corps that he called the Commandant's Trust Study, I said that the image of the junior enlisted man as bored, resistant, negativistic, having to be driven to do anything is a creation of our own practices. Because just imagine if you went to high school, you went to freshman year, and you spent freshman year, and then you were told, okay, you're going to do freshman year over again. And then you finish it a second time, and then you're okay, you're going to do freshman year over again. And you'd be bored, negativistic, resistant. And the experience whenever troops are maintained together and allowed to train progressively is that they maintain their enthusiasm, they maintain their motivation, they become self-starters, they spontaneously develop models of cooperative learning. And so this is something we're doing to ourselves, and we can change it. Now, there is, in addition to what I've just said, there are other very good, specifically military rationales for focusing on the creation and maintenance of trust. Excuse me. One is, when you have these good resources in place, people get psychologically injured less. There's decent empirical evidence for this, primarily coming out of the Israel Defense Forces that have done the best research in this area. Now, let me tell you a little anecdote. I was at a seminar at the Amphibious Warfare School at Quantico, and it was an all-day affair, and there was a lunch. And during the lunch, Lieutenant General Van Riper, at that time the CG of the Combat Development Command, basically kidnapped me from we were sitting there, but he just wanted to talk about prevention. And I said, wow, here's this 3-star who wants to talk to me about prevention. What do I want to talk? I want to talk about prevention. And this 3-star just wants to talk. And I said at one point, General, I'm delighted you're so interested, but please tell me why. I mean, I'm surprised. Tell me why you're so interested. He said, it's a simple readiness matter. If one of my Marines is injured, it doesn't matter whether it's physically or psychologically, they're lost to the force. And I can't replace them so easily. So if you can help us learn how to protect our Marines, we not only want to do it because it's part of Marine culture to take care of your Marines, it's also in our interest. We want to protect our readiness. So number one, it's a simple readiness issue. Number two, if people become morally injured in this way that I'm talking about, that they have experienced a betrayal of what's right in the way Achilles does right at the opening of the Iliad when Agamemnon seizes his geros, his prize of honor, and I remind you that Agamemnon had no more right to seize Achilles' geros than a modern colonel has to take the Medal of Honor ribbon off of the tunic of one of his sergeants and say, well, I don't have one, so I'm putting it on mine. No, I'm not making a dumb cultural imperialistic error here. I'm not moving my culture onto the ancient Greek culture. The text itself makes it clear. In the course of the Iliad, the gods say Agamemnon shouldn't have done that. The other Greek officers say to him, you shouldn't have done that. And eventually Agamemnon says, I shouldn't have done that. So this is not an issue of cultural relativism. Within the terms of that culture, he should not have done that. It was a betrayal of the moral order of that military force. And when that happens, everybody who witnesses it, who gets knowledge of it, is injured. Everybody. And certainly the person who is the target of it, but the motivation, the loyalty, just like air out of a balloon, it just is a catastrophe. Everyone is watching the trustworthiness of the person who holds power. And there are no private wrongs in a military unit. If someone had had the nerve to criticize Agamemnon, he would have probably said, that's none of your business. This is private between me and Achilles. Well, there are no private wrongs. And Agamemnon discovers that the next day when the whole army stampedes to the ships. So that's the second very good military rationale for maintaining trust. The third is, and this has certainly always been true, but today it is true raised to an exponent. And that is that we are moving for a variety of historical and technological reasons to smaller, more dispersed, more agile, more decentralized operating systems. Whether you call it maneuver warfare in the Marine Corps, whether you call it net-centric warfare in the Navy, whether you call it air-land battle in the Army, every single one of these warfighting doctrines, and they are all variants of the same doctrinal concept, all of them require a high level of implicit communication and implicit understanding that is based on power down, on seniors trusting their subordinates and subordinates trusting their superiors. And the fact is that if you don't have both a high level of trust and a high level of competence, maneuver warfare doctrine is probably a catastrophe. It's a formula for those littoral penetrating units getting cut off and annihilated. You must function at a very, very high level to make that a safe and successful way of warfighting. And that's fine, but you have to do it. You can't just pray for it. You can't do public prayer in the form of publishing field manuals and fine doctrinal statements. You have to actually make the institutional changes and the changes in practice and culture that actually bring it about. So that's the third military rationale for high levels of trust. And then finally, and this has always been true, that when the person who, the people in contact with the enemy are able to have all of their sensors directed toward the environment, toward the enemy, their brains directed toward the environment, toward the enemy, and toward what they're trying to accomplish, they are going to do one heck of a lot better than if most of their attention is directed over their shoulder. What does my boss want? Can I figure it out? Because it's not too clear, and what's more, the whole point of it is to make him look good, and that's always been true, but I guess it's in a certain sense a restatement of what I said earlier about maneuver warfare doctrine. A dear friend of mine, a person who was one of the people in on the Marine Corps study, who some of you at least I'm sure know, Bruce Goodmanson, a former Marine officer and now a world-class military historian, has said, if you were able to listen in on the thoughts of the French officers and the German officers facing each other across the Meuse in June of 1940, what would you hear when you listen in on the thoughts? He said, if you listen in on the thoughts of the French officers, the officer would be saying, what does my boss want and how can I give it to him? If you listen in on the thoughts of the German officers, his thoughts are, how can I help my brother officer on my right and my brother officer on my left accomplish this mission? And to our sorrow, we know what the outcome of that fight was. At every point where the German armor broke through the French in 1940, there was a sergeant in a tank that made a decision to go right rather than left or straight ahead. There wasn't a three-star making that decision. There was a sergeant making that decision. And we bled and bled and bled and bled in World War II because of that level of military functioning. Now, I have already tipped my hand that I said that trust is not a nebulous atmospheric thing, that it has the three concrete dimensions of cohesion, leadership, and training. And I will leave it to you to do your own translation, that cohesion is trust in your peers, that leadership is trust in your seniors and subordinates, and training can be spun as trust in yourself and trust in your unit's own skills. Now, the late Ferris Kirkland, a man who generously mentored me over many years until he died recently, put it very compactly, and these are his words: when you know your stuff, when you know your people, and you know your boss is dedicated to your success and will not abandon you, you have confidence. And of course, confidence is simply a synonym for trust. Now, I want to talk about a couple of the really strong interactions among these cohesion, leadership, and training. And the first thing I want to mention is the interaction between unit stability and cohesion and training. I used to be a cohesion purist. It's just good in itself. It's going to protect people in itself. And over years of studying this, I've come to realize that probably the most important thing about it is that if you stabilize units, and there is good empirical evidence of this from the period in the Army, the so-called cohort period in the Army in the 80s, when they kept people together during their whole first term of enlistment, that what happens when you keep people together is that the cognitive and emotional resources that should be going into learning are going into figuring out these new guys. Who is this? Can I trust him? Is he going to carry his load? Is he going to cover my back? Now, this is very simple. This is not new stuff. In fact, I tear what little hair I have left out because we know all this stuff, and we've known it for decades. It's not rocket science. It's not mysterious. We know how to do it. And the trouble is that we're not doing it for cultural and institutional reasons that amount to a set of practices and policies. There are no villains in this piece. The villains are not the personnel people. They are not causing this problem. It is, if there's any villain, it's the culture of management science that we have inherited from the beginning of the 20th century. It's 100 years old, what it is that we're trying to struggle past. Now, I want to point out that there is a profound ethical point to making the changes that allow us to have units with high levels of unit skill, that is team skills, where the people in the units say, and there's nothing mysterious about this, they say it's like we could read each other's minds. And you can do that with any team if you just keep them together, give them good training, good leadership, put them through hard stuff together. They all turn out that way. That's not mysterious. Now, if you have units with high unit skill and competent leaders, the ethical payoff of that, and this is fascinating, I learned this from a retired Marine named John Poole, who wrote a fascinating ethical and religious work called Another Bridge to Cross, Lowering the Cost of War. According to Poole's thinking, the lives and souls of even the enemy combatants who are trying to kill us, their lives and souls are precious to God too, not just ours. And the point of fighting in a just cause is winning, not killing. And the key to winning without unnecessary killing is unit skill and leader competence. So the logic of this syllogism is inescapable, that ethically it is our obligation to create skilled units, skilled cohesive units, and highly competent leaders, so that we can win our fights with as little killing, as few casualties on our side and on the enemy side as is compatible with winning. Now, excuse me, if the cause itself is not just, then we've got a problem. I say we the American citizenry. The people in uniform are not responsible for us sending them into unjust wars. They may be responsible for having judgments about it, but the fact is they don't make the decision what wars we, the citizenry, send them into. So if the cause is just, it is a moral point to fight the fight as skillfully as we possibly can to reduce casualties all around. Now, the matter of why we should stabilize our units and stabilize them intelligently. I'm not talking about some absolute iron-bound, we're never going to let anybody in a 20-year career move from Fort Humpty Dumpty. People tend to push arguments to ridiculous extremes in order to turn it into a fight of a black or white distinction, which is silly. But stabilizing units is a simple matter of do unto others. Nobody would want to be sent into moral danger with people they've never met. And yet, in every war of the 20th century, we have done that. And that is just horrific. Now, I think I'm going to interrupt there and give people a chance to ask questions, make comments, criticisms, tell me that the idea of unit stabilization is a lot of hooey. And believe me, there are people who believe that it's a lot of hooey. So I'd like to hear your comments and questions.
Floor is open.
At both, up and down the chain of command. At the unit level, it was frequently a matter of how quickly officers were rotated, that in the company grade officers in Vietnam, except for the lieutenants, except for the platoon commanders, they were rotated out of troop command billets every 6 months. And if anybody has got to understand the terrain, the weather, probably the most critical person is the battalion commander in that kind of war. To be in the area of operations for long enough to understand the enemy's habits, their specific mix of skills, the terrain, as I mentioned, the weather, which plays a very big role in the kind of war that they were fighting in Vietnam. And the enemy, who has been characterized, and correctly I believe, as the finest light infantry in the world, kept their field grade officers in the area of operations sometimes for 4 and 6 years, so that our 6-month turning over officers were up against people. This was, from the point of view of military skill, this wasn't a fair fight. That's when we're setting things up, we try as much as possible to make sure it's not a fair fight, but in our favor. We want our skills to be the best on the scene, not the enemy's. Now, if anyone has a different view of that, please speak up. I am not a universal expert, and
Shannon?
Well, I don't have a different view of that, but you mentioned earlier that there are no bad guys, but that there's this system that's been in place for about 100 years, a kind of management science that's in the way. I'm very convinced by your work and others along the same lines that unit cohesion is essential. Who are the people resisting it right now? Whether they're, not to paint them as evil in any way, but what has to be done? What do you feel is the current status of this campaign to get it changed?
Well, let me mention that since I started on this quest, which overall has occupied me for the last 10 years, there has been a lot of change already. The Marine Corps implemented a program that they call the Unit Cohesion Program that partially solves the problem. It is a definite step forward that stabilizes Marines in their battalion, and I never was able to discover how much moving around within the battalion there was for first-term Marines. But okay, the Marine Corps is trying that, and it continues. Recently, the Secretary of the Army announced that he was making the introduction of a unit rotation system as opposed to individual rotation and replacement and individual manning. He was making a unit-based system his top priority for his time in that position. And the jury is still out as to what is going to happen there. First of all, when you examine the way the Army runs, you discover that the Personnel Command, G1, is only responsible for half or less than half of the picture. G3, the operations, is the outfit that defines the structure, that defines how many of what MOSs there are in each unit, how many people there are in each unit, and all of that stuff. So G3 establishes the places. G1 tries to match the faces with the places. Well, they, in fact, have no capacity to fix it without full integration of their efforts with the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. And that is, I think, basically true. I mean, the Marine Corps is somewhat more integrated in this regard than the Army, but it's basically true throughout our forces that the people operating the personnel system do not have the capacity to restructure it. It's not within their scope, and they shouldn't take the fall for these problems.
So the changes have got to be made higher up.
The changes,
very structural.
It's very structural. The number of ramifications, it's amazing how many moving parts there are that need to be taken into account, and the whole thing, I believe we're talking about a 10-year job. And one of the reasons that it has not been done before is that nobody is in any of the relevant jobs for long enough to do it. No chief of staff is there for more than 4 years. And then the DESPER is there for 3 if he's there that long, and so on down the line. And then you get down to action officers at lower levels, and they're bouncing through. And so the question is, who is able to maintain the stable leadership and vision to bring this about? And there is one more thing to it, that we've got to deal fairly with the people whose career expectations are going to be altered or even blighted by any change. We're not talking about sweeping out dead wood or getting rid of parasites. We're talking about good people. We're talking about dedicated, intelligent, devoted people who are working insanely hard. This is not a government waste and fraud situation. It's a matter of us renovating our own ways of thinking and acting so that we do better by not only the people that inhabit our institutions, but so that they fight their fights more effectively. And it's not easy, and it's going to take a long time, and we need stability to do that. The amount of cognitive and emotional resources that goes into figuring out new people is incredible. And it's not, for instance, that in our services today, when, as I use that somewhat exaggerated metaphor of restarting freshman year, although literally often they are retraining the same skills at the same levels to bring the new people up to speed, the training, it's one thing to go through the motions of training, which is very objective and external, and you can count it and measure it, and you can say they fired so many practice rounds from the tanks and so forth. But that doesn't measure the learning. And what counts is what people learn, not the boxes that got checked on the externals of going through the motions of the training. And what's lacking when there's too much personnel turbulence is the ability to learn. All of it is going into figuring out the new people, especially if it's new leaders. Well, I have had, ultimately, these are empirically answerable questions. Let me translate what you just said into a very concrete military context. Let's talk about tank gunnery and tank crews. I had an Army colonel at a RAND personnel seminar say to me, "You can't keep tank crews together, they get stagnant. What you need is new blood from Fort Knox, people that have been trained, recently trained, and it'll keep everybody on their toes. And what's more, everybody in that tank gets a chance to move up." Well, that is the management science, that's the American way. Now, I want to give you the contrasting model, and this is a story told to me by General Don Story, who many of you know who he is. He's the honorary colonel of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment at Fort Irwin, the dreaded OPFOR at the National Training Center. He was a SINC, he was TRADOC commander in the 1980s and retired as a 4-star, and on, a man of enormous accomplishments. Because of his armor background, he visited Israel many times, and they're famous for their armor fighting ability. Anyway, he was watching tank gunnery, and he was amazed by what he saw, and the tanker climbed out after the exercise, and he said, "Well, how many practice rounds do you fire a year?" Figuring he was going to say 300 or 400. And the guy shrugged and said, "Well, maybe 8 or 9. And Don said he's astonished to hear this, and apparently this Israeli tanker could see his astonishment, and he said, "Well, you have to understand, General, that we've been on this tank and its predecessor for 15 years together. We all have been together for that long, and we know each other's minds." Now, what goes unstated there is that they know each other's jobs, that they've swapped jobs, not only for the good reason that if one of them is injured, that anybody on the tank can do that job, but just like on a basketball team. And I'm no athlete, so forgive me if I say something totally silly, but just like on a basketball team, if the team really has been together and practiced and played together for a long time, they pass the ball not to where the teammate is, but to where he will be, because they know each other that well. Now, tank gunnery in a real-world situation is not a matter of sitting on a range shooting at a fixed target, which may be testing only the skills of the gunner or of the commander, but in a real-world situation, it's a combination of the driver and the gunner and the commander, and that all of those together is the real-world tank gunnery. And the American system says that military personnel are replaceable parts. Well, the machine metaphor has never, ever been appropriate to what military people do, either in wartime or peacetime. You don't have to, the brake linings do not have to practice with the carburetor in order to work. If the replaceable parts are the right part and they're installed properly, the automobile goes right when you turn the key. It's not that way with any team performance, and ground fighting especially, probably all fighting. I say ground fighting because that's what I know about, or what I know a little bit about. I don't know very much about air. I don't know very much about naval warfare, but when it comes to ground fighting, I've studied and talked with people and feel I've learned a tiny little bit. And it's for sure a team activity. How does it apply in an American context? Well, the answer is that, as I said, this is an empirical question. If you stabilize tank crews for 2 years, which compared to what there is today is an unimaginably long time. I'm not talking about 15 years, and 2 years is well within the window of what American soldiers and Marines who are in armored vehicles do. If you stabilize them for 2 years, not only allow them but encourage them to swap jobs instead of this sort of strict lockstep, well, you're the driver now, and then you'll move up to being the loader, and then you'll move up to being the gunner, and then you'll move up to being the commander. And what's more, once we make you the commander, we'll put you on a different tank because our culture says you cannot command your pals. So we can, mind you, I'm saying this rhetorically because I don't think we need another study. In fact, there are bunches of good empirical studies of this. We don't need more studies. We need to get on with it.
Good question.
What are your thoughts on a citizen army as opposed to a professional army? I gather that you would be opposed to the draft.
In fact, I'm in favor of universal national service for everyone, men and women. And within that context, there would be some who would be interested in military service as a way of discharging that national service. And I can't predict how the numbers would fall out. It would depend on what numbers were needed. But in fact, I'm strongly in favor of compulsory national service. I believe that the healthiest structure is one that's actually quite well known, and in the literature it's known as the continental regimental system, where people come into the service as a cohort, they train together, they go into reserve together, and then that unit dissolves. That's the regimental system. And overall, I think that is probably the healthiest model. It's probably no accident that I am fortunate to be working closely with General Story, who, when he was TRADOC commander, tried to introduce a regimental system into the U.S. Army and was not successful in his advocacy. But there are many advantages to that kind of thing. But I sort of squirm when what I'm saying is described as a professional army, because I don't see that as a necessary thing. I mean, it might be an advantage for people to serve somewhat longer than they serve now, but for there to be either you're in for life or that's it, that's not what I'm advocating. And I don't think that true military competence demands that, although it may be that some roles in the armed forces do demand that, but we have that now. There are people who devote their whole adult lives to being military professionals, and that's fine. But I'm not in any sense saying that everybody in the armed forces has to be a lifelong, like sort of Roman army sort of model.
Another unrelated question that pertains to your experience with Vietnam veterans. When their trust and confidence in leadership is broken,
Right.
Can it be repaired, and if so, how?
Or if you're talking about veterans,
Of that conflict in particular.
if you're talking about veterans, it can be repaired, but it can only be repaired in community. The core of our treatment program is to maintain a safe and stable community of veterans where we believe that they do the heavy lifting. They heal each other. We're just stagehands. The mental health professionals don't belong in center stage, at least in my view. And it is amazing how much recovery of damage to good character is possible. I mean, the average American psychiatrist will tell you, oh, can't ever change, never happen, not possible. Well, as William of Ockham said in the 14th century, what is possible. And we see previously violent, addicted, chaotic people becoming nonviolent, clean and sober, and able to negotiate safe relationships with their
I'm going to
families.
ask you a slightly different question.
Okay.
Not good character, but trust in leadership.
Well, they will never get back naive trust. They will never get their innocence back. But we say to them that the goal of treatment is not to get back childlike trust, but to develop wise trust where you can both accurately judge the trustworthiness of the people in the situation you're in, and if you think it's trustworthy, extend a little bit more trust and see if that's okay. And also, what's almost as important, develop confidence in your own ability to judge, trust in yourself to judge the trustworthiness of other people. Because if everything is a danger situation, then it becomes really impossible to negotiate a life. An apology. It does wonders. The great thing about our clinical program, and let me frame this in terms of my personal real experience. I mess up. I'm not perfect by a long shot. And I mess up, and the wonderful thing about our program is that the relationship is solid enough and durable enough. It has enough of a future that I can apologize, and that means something. It doesn't just lead to, the relationship doesn't just blow apart. Also, it's in the context of an intact community. The other veterans and the other team members. I have been with this team for 15 years, and I'm the newcomer. 15 years. I'm the new guy on the block. And anybody who knows about human services or mental health settings where you're dealing with severely traumatized, addicted, incarcerated people, there's an enormous turnover, an enormous burnout rate. Well, we don't have it. And that's because I think we've figured out some of the basics about how to do this work safely.
Based on your clinical experience, trauma is deep enough. Can an apology not suffice?
Can
an apology not suffice?
Well, if the guy is so offended that he just leaves and never comes back and refuses any contact from anybody, any of the other team members, any of the other veterans, then yes, there's no way to make the apology, then it doesn't work. And that has happened. We make an enormous effort to repair any relationships that are ruptured. But yes, of course, I mean, these are not inpatients on a locked ward. They are free to leave at any time.
I meant that metaphorically, though.
But no, it can be. I have never known a situation with a veteran where it could not be repaired if what has happened is that we've screwed up and then apologize and they won't hear it. For instance, there was one veteran who threatened to kill one of my colleague's wife and children. And not only is that over the line for us, but it's way over the line for the other veterans. And it wasn't until a week or so later that we discovered that the other veterans in the program had mounted a 24-hour rotating guard on all of our houses. And we basically said, hey, wait a minute, this is putting you all back in combat mode. This was not a serious threat. He was just trying to get us to do X, Y, and Z, and call off the watch. This is not needed. And that guy has never been able to come back, very possibly because the other veteran said to him, don't you show your face here again. But,
you have a question on your right there.
Oh, sure. There is a phenomenon, and at this moment I want to mention for people here and also for the videotape that I have written about something that I call the social horizon. The question, how far is the social horizon? How far can you see with your heart? How far do you feel that these people are people that I'm connected to and who I care about and who care about me? And I wrote about that in the Commandant's Trust study, and that piece of it is posted in a website called www.belisarius, belisarius.com, and then click on authors and you'll see my name, and it's the thing on cohesion. And that is a very important question, and it really addresses a kind of mismatch between the way our institutions are designed around huge formations, divisions. Even a battalion is a huge group compared to what we as human beings seem to be naturally wired for. Unless you're the sergeant major, the battalion is too large a group for anyone to feel directly connected to. Now, I want to make a distinction here between two very closely related terms. Cohesion that we've used, which in the social science literature, and I think this is legitimate, is purely a face-to-face primary group phenomenon. And then there's esprit de corps, which can apply to not only a battalion, but to a regiment, to a division. It can apply to the whole Marine Corps. It can apply to the whole U.S. Armed Services. It can apply to a whole nation. Esprit de corps is virtually infinitely expandable. And the traditional American model is all we need from our service members is excellent individual training and good esprit de corps. You put the two together and you get everything you need. And I submit that it's not everything you need. You need that face-to-face team cohesion. And that is in smaller groups, and the question is, how large is that group? Now, probably there are breakpoints in how our brains are wired for group functioning. Probably the largest primary group is about the size of a company, probably about 125, 150 people, which by coincidence turns out to be the size of the group in which our modern human brains apparently evolved. That apparently the modern human, as we are today, evolved in the Paleolithic in groups that were no larger than 150 souls. And I think we can still see the footprints of our ancestral environment in how we relate to groups of that size. The military company, is a division on a ship about that size, or depends? I guess it depends.
Tend to be a little smaller than that.
A little smaller. And then there is another break point that's down roughly in the 25 to 35 range, which by a funny coincidence is in the neighborhood of a platoon. And then there's another break point that's probably down around a dozen, and then another that's down around 3. And I don't think we may ever know in detail. We certainly won't know in detail how those evolved. We may not know in detail exactly how they work neurologically, but there is interesting evidence that there are naturally significant group sizes. And I don't pretend to have all of the answers in my back pocket as to. The regimental system is the classic locus of esprit de corps. A regiment is typically in the neighborhood of 3,000, 3,500, and so forth. It's much too large for cohesion. And within the regiment, in the continental regimental system, you have, and then within the battalions, you have the companies. And that I'm not sure that the regimental system per se makes a big difference in that regard.
To your left.
You haven't, yeah. Clearly, yes, a short war does. I mean, the duration and the intensity are both important factors. But there's plenty of evidence that, number one, you don't leave units in the line until everyone's cooked. People think that the only two choices are either to leave people in the line until everybody's dead or insane, like they did in the Civil War at times, or an individual replacement system, an individual replacement and rotation system, where the unit as an administrative entity is in the line eternally and the people flow in and out. Those aren't the only two alternatives. The other alternative is a unit replacement system where when the unit is either tired, which is a decision that command can make, or attritted down to a point that it is losing its effectiveness, the whole unit can be pulled out and replaced with another one. And then that unit, out of immediate danger, not sent home, but out of immediate danger, can re-equip, retrain, recadre, and the replacements integrated with the combat-proven veterans who can pass on the local lore of that particular...
But do we worry if the war lasts 7 days or 100 hours?
Well, God willing, yeah. Well, if it does, that's wonderful. But I'm not following the question. We can't order up a war to last 100 hours.
At what point does a certain amount of combat is clearly the threshold, you would say? Is it measured in hours, days, intensity?
There have been various attempts to answer this, and actually the 12-month individual rotation system in Vietnam supposedly had the well-intentioned purpose of pulling people out of Vietnam before the calculated 100 and whatever 55 days that the statisticians calculated that in World War II, that if you were in combat for so many days, the chances of you breaking down psychologically rose steeply, and that supposedly that was what was behind the 12-month rotation. But, I mean, in terms of the number of people who were evacuated from the theater in Vietnam for psychiatric breakdown, that was minuscule in Vietnam. So if that is the measure, then that policy was a brilliant success. However, number one, it's not real clear how honestly people were being looked at psychiatrically, number one. And number two, it seems to have just exported the psychiatric problems back to the home units and then to the civilian world. So definitely units should be rotated. There's no question about that. And I have a terrible memory for numbers, but there are numbers on the relative durability of units in the European theater in World War II, comparing like similar units, Americans versus British, where the Brits were pulled out very much earlier for rest and then put back in, whereas the American units just stayed in the line until people died or were casualties, and they were not rotated, and it was incredibly wasteful of blood and spirit. Yeah.
Sir, what's a relationship between individuals' faith or spiritualness and their susceptibility to the loss of trust and treatment?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I have been struck by the fact that the overwhelming majority of the veterans that I work with, which is a relatively small number from a specific ecology, I joke about the fact that more than half of the veterans in my program are from the Southie Marine Regiment, South Boston, which is overwhelmingly Irish Roman Catholic, sent huge numbers proportionately of people to the Marine Corps during the Vietnam era. And overwhelmingly, the veterans that I treat lost their faith in Vietnam. They say with a whole lot of profanity that I'm not going to repeat that if God let this happen, I don't want anything to do with him. And so I ask myself, is it that I am seeing the people selectively for whom their religious faith did not sustain them, or it broke? What I'm saying is I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm intensely curious myself. This is another case where there's an opportunity for good empirical research if people are tenacious and skillful enough to pull it off well. It's not an easy study to do. I believe that chaplains have an enormous amount to contribute in this area. And I, in fact, speak several times a year at the chaplain school in Newport and find that a profoundly valuable experience for me. And I can't tell you for sure what the answer is. I thank you for, in effect, renewing that question, because I didn't answer it as well. I mean, there's the famous wound to trust that people took because of the malfunctioning consistently of the early models of the M16 and the ammunition that was issued with it. The horror of going into a firefight and not being able to trust your personal weapon is something that is just beyond fathoming. And so people attributed the blame for that in various places. They attributed it to the government, vaguely and diffusely. They attributed it to the manufacturers. They attributed it to the military authorities who approved issue of the weapon and its ammunition before adequate field testing. I mean, as it stands today, this same weapon is a reliable and trustworthy individual weapon. I mean, it's still the M16, but it's been ironed out. And so that's an example where they attributed the betrayal varies a lot from person to person and situation to situation. The matter of the reception when they came home, I would never ever minimize the impact of indifference or hostility to a returning service member after a fight. Never minimize it at all. But I believe that if people came home together as units, it would matter far less what that public reception was. Far, far less. We cannot control the public's opinion of a given war. We can't control it, and very possibly we wouldn't want to control it. But we can control how people are brought home. And so the overwhelming preventive psychiatry recommendation is train people together, send them into danger together, and bring them home together. It's very simple.